Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stand for Innocence 2020. My name is Laura Zaraski, and I serve as Executive Director for Washington Innocence Project. We are so glad you're here joining us for this 8th annual benefit event. Stand for Innocence is truly the cornerstone of our community fundraising efforts here at Washington Innocence Project, and it's the single most important event we have all year to meet our fundraising goals. So we're hoping that you have enjoyed getting to know our freed and exonerated clients through the short videos that we have been releasing through our listserv and through social media all through September. And if you're not receiving our emails yet, please be sure to visit our website at WAInnocenceProject.org and sign up. So because it's 2020 and everything is different in 2020, this 8th annual Stand for Innocence event is entirely online this year. And we really do wish that we could gather in the same room, but since health and safety really have to be the most important priority these days, we've put together a 30-minute Stand for Innocence main event video to bring you closer to our work and understand the need for our financial support now that we have transitioned from a program of the University of Washington to an entirely independent nonprofit. In addition to raising funds to support our work, Stand for Innocence is really also an opportunity every year that we love to bring together everyone from across the state who supports our work, including members of the community who want to help us fight for the actually innocent in Washington state, former Innocence Clinic students from the University of Washington School of Law, attorneys at firms and local corporations who provide pro bono case support, our incredible staff and board, and of course, members of the Washington Innocence Project Freed and Exonerated family. I'd like to take just a minute right now to thank our sponsors for this event. We have T-Mobile and the Washington Association of Corporate Counsel and River Styx Foundation have all really generously supported our fundraising so far this year. So whether you've attended each year or this is your first time at Stand for Innocence, we are so glad to have you with us. I'll provide just a little bit of background for those of you who are new. We were established in 1997 under the name Innocence Project Northwest. Washington Innocence Project was the third innocence-focused legal services organization in the United States. And today we are independently run and funded. Now we're based in Seattle, as many of you know, but we represent prisoners with convictions from all over the state of Washington who have viable claims of actual innocence, from Spokane to Clark County and every county in between. So during this Q&A today, we'll get into some detail about how it is that we do our work, but the short version is that we use DNA or any kind of other newly discovered evidence that wasn't available at the time of the trial to advocate for those who have been convicted of crimes that they didn't commit. In addition, we've been working for the past 10 years towards statewide policy reforms based on the leading causes of wrongful conviction, and we do all that we can to support our freed and exonerated families as they work to rebuild their lives in freedom. So thank you again so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We are independently run and funded, so please donate what you can and share our work with others in your community who might not know about what we do, so that we can continue our 23-year history of fighting for Washington's wrongly convicted well into the future. So joining me today, as you can see on your screen, is our incredible Washington Innocence Project staff and two of our esteemed members of the Washington Freed and Exonerated family, Heidi Goodwin and Haroon Sharif. And each of us is going to take a minute here to introduce ourselves, and then we'll get on with the questions and answers. So for my part, again, I'm Laura Zaraski, the Executive Director. I joined the squad as our first policy staff attorney a decade ago in 2010 and served as Policy Director until last year when I moved into the role of Executive and Policy Director. In the time as Policy Director, we passed 3 state laws here in Washington state. The first was to compensate the wrongly convicted in 2013. The second was to preserve biological evidence like DNA that's collected from crime scenes in 2015. And the last one was to encourage best practices by the government in the area of eyewitness identification and the use of incentivized testimony. So now I'm going to turn it over to everyone else here so you can get to know them. Eliza, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Hi, I am Eliza Exel. I am the paralegal for the Washington Innocence Project. I have been with Wash IP for about 1.5 years now. And I am sort of a jack of all trades. I support the attorneys in the investigation. I oversee case intake, and I'm often the person you might speak to on the phone. I'm also someone who supports fundraising and events and other nonprofit related things. So I'll pass it on to Caitlin.
Hi, I'm Kaylin Logrovich. I have been a WASH IP squad member for a little over a year now as a DNA staff attorney. And so my job is really just focused on identifying cases where we can identify evidence items that can be submitted for DNA testing, and then also working on obtaining that DNA testing either through negotiations with prosecutors or by going to court and trying to get a court order to test the DNA evidence in our cases. So with that, I'll hand it off to Valentina to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Valentina Guy. I am the administrative assistant at Washington Innocence Project. I've been a part of this team for about 4 months. And so I kind of just help everyone and support everyone in their roles. I work closely with Eliza with application intake. And so if anyone sends a letter to us, I'm often the one reading it. And from there, we take the steps to go through each case. And so, yeah, I'm excited to be here with you all. And I'll hand it over to Heidi.
Hi, my name is Heidi Goodwin, and I'm a freed client of the Washington Innocence Project. In 2006, I started serving a 10-year sentence, and in 2007, the Washington Innocence Project came on to assisting with my case. In 2014, they filed a petition in my case that has been overturned and upheld by both the higher courts in our state. So that's where I'm at. And Haim.
Hello, my name is Haim Sharif. I'm a freed client, part of the Washington Innocence Project, but out of Nevada. In 1988, I was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. In 2013, my legal representation out of Arizona contacted then the Northwest Innocence Project, and the director at that particular time was Jackie McMurphy, I believe, and gained her assistance in having an amicus brief. First, a referral was done, and the referral was granted, and of course, the Washington's Innocence Project assisted my legal team at that particular time in not only writing but having the amicus brief submitted to court. Later in 2017, June 7th, I was freed, and I sit here with my sister before all of you.
Thank you so much, Haim. And I know that you said that you're not one of ours, but we claim you anyway. So you actually are 100% a part of our freed and exonerated family. So we're so happy that you're here. And thank you to everybody for those introductions. That was great. Everybody's representing. That's perfect. So I think now we can just jump into some of the questions that we've received. And so the very first question that we have, very apt for what we just heard from Heidi and Haim, is what's the difference between a freed and exonerated client? So this is a question that you hear us make the distinction, and there's a lot of question about what that means. So we're more than happy to help you understand. So the very first thing, the most important thing to remember about our freed and exonerated clients are that mostly the things that they have in common are the most important things. And that's that they're free and that they were actually innocent of the crime of which they were convicted. So that's the most important thing. There's more similar than different about our freed and exonerated clients, but there is a distinction that we like to make, and I'll explain here why. So our criminal legal system is really limited in how people who have been involved in the system are labeled. So generally you're a suspect or you're a defendant, and then you're either convicted or you're acquitted. And then, sometimes you'll have a conviction that's overturned for a variety of reasons, but there's not really a whole lot of nuance in terms of understanding what that means, like the reason that the conviction was overturned. So where do innocent people fit into that whole landscape? And the short answer is that they really don't. Our system is just really not set up to acknowledge its own mistakes. And so we don't have this system that says this person was guilty, this person was innocent, and this person never should have been system involved at all. We really just don't have one of those categories. And so we have to, we've come up with our own way of discussing it to try to help people understand that this is really a systemic failure. And so we look at it a few different ways. Now, there's a resource out there that's great called the National Registry of Exonerations, and that tracks every known case of wrongful conviction in the United States. And they track those that they call exonerations. And by that, they mean a person who was convicted of a crime and later declared actually innocent of that crime, or they were relieved of all legal consequences of the crime because evidence of innocence that later came up that wasn't presented at the time of trial. And that's pretty much the definition that we use too, because it's important to acknowledge those cases for which there has been an official recognition that a wrongful conviction happened. With that said, there are a tremendous number of people, so many more than we would ever be able to count, who were innocent when they went through the system, but they were really left no option other than to sacrifice their chance for ever being called exonerated and recognized as actually innocent, to either save their life or just to simply get out of prison to be able to continue on with life in freedom. For example, if a prisoner accepts an Alford plea, they can be released from prison while still maintaining their innocence by admitting that the evidence the prosecution had could have resulted in their conviction, and so they're agreeing to a plea in order to secure their freedom. In other words, a lot of people are put into a position where they have to make a decision: do I want to roll the dice again with a system that has already failed me? And that can be a pretty much impossible choice for anyone to make. And yet, some people do, some people don't have that freedom. So sometimes our clients have to accept these kinds of pleas, whether it's an Alford plea or a plea to something else that the prosecution has offered, just so that they can continue rebuilding their lives. And so Heidi and Haim can both have some things to say on this one, so I'll turn it over to you too.
Yeah, so I remain a freed client right now. As Laura was saying, for me personally, I have a fear or a terror of going back to court. In 2014, when we filed the petition, it took 2 years, and in 2016, the state appellate court unanimously overturned that conviction and remanded it back to the county for a retrial. It was then appealed, and we went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld that decision. Up until that point, I had been all fight. I had been, let's take it all the way. I don't care what they threaten me with. I'm ready to do this. However, during the Supreme Court's decision, or while we were waiting for it, I became pregnant with my daughter, Havana. And the trauma of being separated from my first 3 children really came to surface during this pregnancy. And towards the latter part of the pregnancy, unknown to any of us, my attorneys at the Washington Innocence Project received 2 photos taken from my Facebook page that were sent by the Clark County DA's office. No notes, no messages. One of them was me pregnant, and one of them was with me hugging my dog. And it was just this really ominous feeling. Washington Innocence Project stepped in to protect me. They took it as a threat on my pregnancy and the baby that I was carrying, and the potential that they could take the baby from me and make us go through a lot of hoops and loops. And so Washington Innocence Project stepped in to protect me, contacted a family law attorney to make sure that we had all of our bases covered before I went into labor and delivery. When she was born, thankfully, nothing happened. We didn't have to utilize the family law attorney in a court setting, and nothing actually ever occurred as far as them doing anything. But the damage done to me mentally and emotionally was irreparable at that point. I then became afraid again of them, and the ball is literally in my court. Washington Innocence Project is waiting for me to say, I'm ready to keep fighting, but I am scared to keep fighting. And so that is why I remain a freed client.
Well, I'm a freed client, of course, out of the Nevada judicial system. As I alluded to earlier, in 2000 and the end of 2013, a decision was made in my case that basically sent my case to the Nevada State Supreme Court, at which time that's when the Washington Innocence Project, Northwest at that particular time, came into the picture, working with my legal team in Arizona, and the amicus brief was issued. And I think the actual decision was rendered in September of 2016, which essentially said that the Nevada State Supreme Court believed that the evidence showed that I was innocent, but yet my case would have still had to go to the next stage, which was the district court, to have the evidence, which was through an evidentiary hearing, weighed to determine whether it was valid or not. At that particular time, my legal team went through negotiations with the district attorney at that time, and through that, a couple of ridiculous, absurd offers were made. One was actually life without. That's what they literally offered. And ultimately, it got down to waive your appeal, will amend the sentence, which means change the sentence. And as a result of, I mean, to put it bluntly, duress, because essentially, if I hadn't taken the deal, the case would have been prolonged. Even if I won the decision in the district court, which more than likely would have happened, the district attorney would have appealed, and that appeal would have dragged out some 4 or 5 years more. And given the makeup of the courts, especially with what Donald Trump is doing, not only to the United States Supreme Court, but also to the federal circuit courts, rolling the dice like that, especially with conservative jurists, it wasn't something that we wanted to take the chance in doing, because unfortunately the system is more political than it is actually based on justice itself. It's not necessarily based on the Constitution like it's supposed to. So as a result, instead of having the case dragged out for potentially 5 to 7 years, if not longer, I had to agree to that deal under duress, of course. And as a result, I'm here as a free client.
And if I could just add one more thing to the duress piece that he's talking about, and I think that's really what it boils down to. Does he choose to continue to sit on death row or gain his freedom?
Right.
Those are the kind of, basically choices that we're faced. So for me, going back to my daughter, Havana, do I want to leave her motherless by continuing to fight my case in a system that has already convicted me once? Right. This is duress. We're basically having to choose our life, the life of our children and our families, over what is right and what is justice in a system that doesn't work.
Exactly, and especially in the situation where I was incarcerated when I was 19. I got out just before my 49th birthday. So 20s, 30s, almost all my 40s gone. My son then was 29. Going on 29, I had 3 grandkids at that particular time. So I missed all my son's life. I could at least be present to participate in my grandchildren's life.
And so, and the Washington Innocence Project is just with us every step of the way through this.
Exactly.
And probably will be forever.
Yes, we will. Hyman and Heidi, could you just, for people who don't know or haven't had a chance to listen to your story, could you just remind us how many years you were incarcerated?
I was sentenced to 15, reduced to 10 on appeal, and I served the full sentence, 8.5 years with good time.
I was incarcerated a total of 29 years and a month and a half, 28 years and 2 months I spent on death row in Nevada from April 19th, 1988 until June 7th, 2017.
Thank you.
All right, so our next question is, does everyone who is innocent get compensated? And so the answer to that is unfortunately no. I think there's a common misconception that when innocent people are released from prison, the state just says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Here's a few $1,000,000 to make up for it." And it would be great if it worked like that, but that's just not the case. It often takes years for people to receive compensation, whether they try to do that through a state statute or a lawsuit. And doing that often involves a really long and traumatic battle. A lot of state compensation laws require a finding that the person is innocent, that official recognition that Lara and Haydeen were just talking about, which is really hard to get in a lot of cases. And then if you go the lawsuit route, you have to show that the person's civil rights were intentionally violated by state officials, which is also extremely difficult to do. So it's just a really difficult process and by no means automatic. I believe the Innocence Project did a study and found that only about a third of people who had been exonerated through DNA evidence ended up receiving compensation, which just isn't enough. And the compensation is never going to be enough to make up for what innocent people experience in prison, but it seems like it's the least the state could do to help people get back on their feet once they are released. And unfortunately, it's extremely difficult for people to even get that. But I will let Heidi and Haim share their thoughts on that as well.
I think, you listening to us describe what we have to go through with our cases, you could understand why we may never see any compensation. But I think more importantly than that, what a lot of people, even those that get some compensation, most of the time, no one gets an acknowledgement. Like the compensation is not an acknowledgement from the system that did the wrong, that did the harm. And this spreads across not just from free clients, not just exonerated who got compensation, but original crime survivors and victims in the cases. There is a huge gap in acknowledgement of that the system has done wrong.
Correctly.
So we not only will we not only get compensation, more than likely we will never get an acknowledgement or an apology.
Yeah, and that's the more important issue with me as far as the acknowledgement, especially having that wrongful conviction hang over your head for so long. But of course, I'm pretty sure the both of us and anyone who's gone through that experience would love to be compensated, but ultimately you fight during that period of time to have your name cleared and to have the state acknowledge that they basically messed up and that they're holding themselves accountable and they're taking the necessary steps forward to ensure that individuals such as myself and my sister Heidi won't get caught up in the system like that again, and that there's certain safeguards put in place that will prevent that from happening. And to know that that's not happening is the more disturbing thing to me.
I'm so angry that I want the apology, but I don't want it because I'm still so angry. Who I want them apologized to is my children.
Yes.
Is my family.
Yes.
My children, because I'm the one that has to apologize to them. Yeah. I'm the one that has to carry the responsibility that the system did to us.
Exactly.
And so I want them to apologize to my children.
Thank you for that. And if I could, I'm just going to jump in a little bit because we do have a compensation statute in Washington State. So this was the first policy reform that we worked on in 2010 when I first came on board as the policy staff attorney. And I think we just have to acknowledge that that statute was intended to avoid a lot of the pain that Haim and Heidi are talking about, a lot of this lack of recognition from the state that a wrongful conviction has happened is really pervasive. Even among our DNA exoneration cases, we have 15 exonerees and 24 freed clients, if you include those who are not fully exonerated. And of all those cases, 2 and maybe 3 of those cases, the prosecutor today acknowledges that a wrongful conviction happened. So this is even beyond, this is in DNA cases, these are in full exoneration cases where the courts have acknowledged that a wrongful conviction happened to the extent that they are able to. But then the state has continued to persist. The law was written so that the state attorney general's office would be the one representing the state, to take it out of those local jurisdictions to hopefully remove some of the sort of emotion and attachment to convictions that will happen in smaller local jurisdictions. And unfortunately, the way that that statute has been applied, I think we've had one case in which our client was given compensation by agreement. Everyone else has had to then go on, after proving their case in criminal court, to then argue with the attorney general's office and sometimes litigate those cases to say, we deserve this acknowledgement that this happened in this case. And so I think this is just a really important point to bring up. I think there's also a sort of misconception that innocence cases have been around so long, we've known about this problem for so long, is the state must be getting better about this. And what I think we've found is that the state is getting a lot better at acknowledging that it happens somewhere, but there is still a tremendous amount of resistance to acknowledging that a wrongful conviction has happened in any one particular jurisdiction. And so that's really not helpful, for our clients who still end up having to make that fight, and they can say, well, innocence cases happen, but they just didn't happen here. And so the fight does not end once the court doors are open, or once the jail doors are open. It just continues on and on. So thank you again for that. And I think we'll have to move on to our next question, or anyone who knows me will know that I'll just keep on talking all day. So I'll just move it all along.
Thank you, guys. So our next question is a common one that we get, and it's, how do innocent people get help from WASH IP? How does the process start? So historically, we get between 300 and 500 requests a year. And these application requests can happen in different ways, via letter. So we often get mail letters from inmates. And it can happen online. You can request an application online, or you can call us. And these applications can be requested by a family member, a friend, or the applicant themselves can request an application. Sometimes other inmates request applications for people they know who are innocent of a crime. And so in order to receive our services, you must follow our basic criteria. And so you must be currently incarcerated, and you must be currently incarcerated in Washington State. So we try to, if we receive letters from, someone who's incarcerated in a different state, we do refer them out to an innocence organization in that state. And so you also must have exhausted all of your remedies. So your appeals process must be complete and finalized. And then you have to have a claim of actual innocence. So we typically do not take cases where there's an affirmative defense, meaning, if there was self-defense, or if you had a theory of, consent or accidental death in that particular case. So we're very limited in the kind of cases that we can take. The legal system has a whole bunch of barriers for post-conviction relief, and so if you don't qualify for, if you don't meet our basic criteria, we don't take any judgment, or we don't have any belief about your guilt or your innocence. We are very limited, and so we wish we could help everyone, but it's very difficult. So yeah, but also I want to add that just because you don't meet or qualifying criteria at first, that doesn't mean that it's like the end of the road. Heidi has some experience with that, so I'll let her talk about that.
Yeah, so I started serving this sentence in 2006, and within that first year, my family, I believe it was my sister-in-law Jamie, had obtained or learned about the Innocence Project and obtained an application and had mailed it to me inside, and I filled it out and sent it in. I believe my mom also had contact with Jackie and Kelly Canary and some of the other staff at Washington Innocence Project. It was Innocence Project Northwest still back then. Initially, they had gotten back to me and said that there was just nothing that they saw that they could do for me right at that moment, at that time. A lot of the cases were DNA involved cases that they were taking on, and my case did not involve DNA. So they had basically just said, you know, we're sorry, but there's nothing that we can do. About a year later, I believe it was Kelly Canary reached out to me. I'm not really sure exactly how it happened, but they had let me know that Jackie McMurtry and Kelly Canary had gone to an Innocence Network conference. And while they were there, there was a discussion occurring about the controversy around the SBS cases, and that there were cases being overturned because of this faulty science. The science had been evolving. And so they had reached out and basically said, we're coming on board. And then they haven't left me since.
Oh, well, like I stated earlier, December 2013, there was a ruling made in my case, and the district court didn't do the right thing. So as a result, it had to be appealed to the Nevada State Supreme Court, at which time my lead attorney, Kerry Sandman, reached out to Jackie McMurtry. Is it McMurtry? McMurtry. Got you. Got you. Okay. And of course, being in a different state, she had to do a referral. Did a referral to the Innocence Network, and the Innocence Network then contacted Washington's Innocence Project Northwest at that particular time, and they Jackie worked along with my lead counsel in putting together the amicus brief, and continue to stay involved in the case and during that process, actually up until the actual negotiation for the deal was ultimately resolved. So,
and I think it's important right now to add at this particular, in this part of our conversation, that not only did they come on in 2007, Washington Innocence Project, but because there were so many difficult dynamics in my case, they also sought help and assistance from pro bono attorney at Perkins Coie, and together they worked together basically to continue to fight for me and use all the resources that both the pro bono and Washington Innocence Project could provide for me.
So our next question is, do you only review cases with DNA to prove someone's innocence? So no, not necessarily. So the thing that we are looking for in all of our cases is, in order to get back into court, you have to present some sort of newly discovered evidence that was unavailable at the time of trial. And so that newly discovered evidence can be DNA that either wasn't tested before trial, or maybe it was tested, but it was done so long ago that now the technology has developed in a way where we can get better results. But newly discovered evidence can also be something not related to DNA. So for example, if a key witness at the trial has recanted, or maybe there was an expert that testified at trial about some sort of science that proves that the person did it, but later, more scientific research has invalidated that kind of testimony and proved it to be false. So we do begin our review process with an eye towards DNA, because if there are evidence items that can be tested to help prove someone's innocence, then we definitely want to test it. So that process entails reviewing all of the documents in a case, the trial transcripts, police reports, crime lab reports, just to figure out, what happened, what evidence is available, what was the evidence presented against the person. And then we have to, if we do identify evidence items that we might want to test, locate that evidence. And then if we find it, then move forward with a request for DNA testing, which often has to be a fight in the courts to even get the DNA testing done, and then go from there depending on the results that we get. But there have been times when we've identified evidence that we want to test only to discover that it's been destroyed. So, we run into roadblocks there. But also, a majority of criminal cases don't even have DNA that's available to test. So, sometimes we do have to get creative, and we will do that as well. I think it's about 5 of our 15 exonerees were DNA exonerations. So we don't limit our cases to DNA cases, but we definitely like to see DNA evidence when we have it available as well.
So, so yeah, the DNA, initially when I had applied, I think Washington Innocence Project Northwest at the time was really only working or wanting to take cases with DNA, because obviously that's easy, right? Well, we think that it is. And so, but in my case in particular, there was never a crime committed. That is our stance.
Right.
I have spent so many years now having to feel like I have to come up with the explanations, having to defend myself, when I realize now that I don't have to do that any longer, because, there was not a crime committed. And so in those cases in particular, how would DNA even apply? And so that's basically, I think, the same as my brother.
Yeah. Because in my case, it wasn't a matter of DNA evidence either, but it was a medical issue, and proper procedures weren't followed. And around the time that the Washington Innocence Project came in at the beginning of 2014, the medical evidence had already been established that would show that, in all likelihood, that my daughter passed away from a disease called Barlow's disease, as opposed to blunt force trauma, which is what the state of Nevada had alleged. And I mean, we had the Washington Innocence Project showed no problem whatsoever in coming into my case and lending their support and advocating for me. So I can't say that that they had any issues. So I mean, but just like my sister, there wasn't a crime in my case. My daughter didn't die as a result of blunt force trauma or abuse, as they alleged. As they had alleged, and it was just a matter of having the medical evidence being heard, and like I said, Washington Innocence Project was instrumental in having that heard, being presented before the Nevada State Supreme Court, and having that rule, a unanimous rule at that, being rendered, and ultimately my case was sent back down to the district court and everything.
I think that it's important as a nation right now, we are having discussions about science and the accuracy of science. And although there is a lot of scientific facts, and sometimes those facts are absolute, you know, with certain things in the climate in the country, there is also a side of science that is fallible. It can be manipulated, it can be corrupted, and things can happen. And my case was petitioned back to the higher courts on new evidence because the science had changed. It had become relative, and so and then identifying again like these other factors that had probably occurred. And so I think that it's just good for people to keep that in mind, that when science shows itself to be wrong, it needs to be acknowledged. And going back to what Laura was saying with, you know, the systems, the prosecutors and them not doing it, they need to acknowledge that science is not always absolute. It's absolute till it's not.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, not only is that to be should be considered. When you're talking about science, especially medical evidence, you also have to bear in mind that human beings are involved. The forensic pathologists are involved, and they're not above question. They're definitely not above question, and because in my particular case, Dr. Nina Hollander, I don't understand one, while she was working as the deputy coroner of Clark County, when she had a track record going back to the late 70s, all the way in New Jersey. And even after she was forced to resign, she ended up in King County, Seattle. She passed away now, but yeah, yeah. Despite her track record, ended up in King County, because instead of the district attorney's office doing what they should have done, which was requested that she had been fired and bring charges up against her for basically offering, producing false information in several cases, not just my case. They allowed her to go under the radar with a resignation, and now she was left to come up to Seattle and work there, and there's no telling how many cases she could have potentially affected negatively in King County. And it's because the district attorneys and other people in place are not operating properly.
And so I think it's important to point out here the resources that Washington Innocence Project, it's DNA cases are clear cut, a little more clear cut. Even those can get very convoluted as well. But outside of the DNA cases, when they're dealing with this science that's evolving and who is going to testify to that, this is a large amount of resources that Washington Innocence Project is going to have to put into gathering that information.
Thank you for that. And that's actually kind of a perfect segue, because I think that you both just added a couple of items onto our policy agenda. So, there's that. We have a never-ending list. So that's a nice segue into our next question, which is, what is Innocence Project's role in the conversations on criminal justice reform? And so I've mentioned this a couple of times, that we've actually had a position in our organization for the last 10 years. And among the Innocence Network organizations, and we'll talk a little bit about the Innocence Network in just a minute, but among those organizations, we were the first one to have, other than the Innocence Project in New York, of which we're friends but totally separate, we're the first Innocence Network organization to have a dedicated policy person. And this is because we recognize with these 300 to 500 requests for assistance that we're getting every year, and all these cases where we see the same problems over and over and over again, that we have an obligation not just to do everything we can for the people that we can reach who are writing to us to help them directly in their case, but we have an obligation to carry that information forward and help people to understand what the institutional problems are with our criminal justice system that repeatedly, over and over and over again, lead to wrongful convictions. So this is where, in a lot of ways, I think you can look at wrongful convictions as sort of the canary in the coal mine of the criminal justice system. A lot of people for many, many years tried to say, well, That's just a weird set of circumstances. That's a one-off. That's an outlier. That case isn't how it is. But what we know from now over 100 years of tracking wrongful convictions in the United States is that there are about 5 or 6 primary causes of wrongful conviction that have been convicting the innocent since the beginning of our system. Mistaken eyewitness identification, false testimony by people who are given incentives in exchange for their testimony against someone else, false confessions, bad science that Haim and Heidi have both been talking about, either because it was bad at the time that the testimony was given or because the science has evolved. All of these things have been contributing factors to known cases of wrongful conviction since at least 1932, when a book was published by Edwin Borchert in 1932, where he said, hey, here's all the reasons that we know people are convicted who are innocent. And those are the same things that we know now through all of these cases that have been tracked, which are now close to 3,000 cases nationally, if you look at the National Registry of Exonerations. Almost 400 are DNA exonerations alone. And so we really have always felt a responsibility at Washington Innocence Project to take this information forward and to do everything we can to have what we know about flaws in the criminal justice system. And as Haim really aptly pointed out, human bias that is such an incredibly important part of our system, that we have to be able to bring those lessons forward to try to improve the system. And we have been, again, working on this for a long time, and most of the time we're a minority in the room. We're kind of the little voice against very powerful forces in state legislatures and in policy-making realms, where we're saying, we know that this information is annoying because it really calls into question basically everything that you do that involves human judgment. But that little annoyance is a lot of people's lives that are being sacrificed for not acknowledging that mistakes can happen and that they will happen as long as human beings who are all fallible are going into it. Not because anyone's a bad person, just because they're people. Just by virtue of being a human being, we're going to make mistakes. And so, our approach to criminal justice reform and those conversations has always been very rooted in our cases. This is what we know. If someone has any kind of cognitive disability or is youthful or has any kind of, vulnerability in that way, they are prone to falsely confess. We know that if someone is given an incentive in their own case to give testimony against someone else, if it's going to help them, very often, even if it's utterly false information, they are going to testify to it in order to get a benefit for themselves. These are the kinds of things that over and over and over again we've heard. And unfortunately, as much as it's been something that no one ever wants to talk about when they're in the room, official misconduct is the leading cause of wrongful conviction in all cases. That's official misconduct, meaning police and prosecutors. And that's not just, making an honest mistake, as we sometimes call it. That's misconduct. That is those people in those positions representing us as the public, doing their job in a way that they know is unconstitutional because presumably they know that this person is innocent, and so the means justify the ends. Well, that's never how it's supposed to work in the American criminal justice system. And so much of our work at Washington Innocence Project in talking about wrongful convictions in the policymaking world is really about trying to convince people that very often, too often, the system doesn't even work the way that we say it does. The prosecutors have an obligation under the Constitution to turn over any information that could assist the defense. In almost all of our cases, we will find Brady violations, a violation of that constitutional rule, sometimes so egregious that they led to that wrongful conviction. And so that's a simple, very common example of how the system does not work the way we already say it does. And so in order to go in and try to reform the system, we have to first say, we could go at this a couple of ways. We can make sure that that never happens, or we can just put in safeguards to make sure that there are actual professional consequences so that prosecutors and law enforcement are actually held to the obligation to do their job properly. Because right now there really are no consequences at all. And we are seeing the fallout of that, not just in innocence work, but in so many different areas of the criminal justice system now that has really been amped up just over the year 2020. We have seen so much movement in that area where so many people are starting to really understand and acknowledge more publicly problems with the system that I think we've been trying to talk about in our small way with our small numbers in the innocence community for a very long time. And this is a moment where some of those issues are really being amplified. So for as long as we have been around. We have been working on trying to improve the system to prevent these injustices from happening. As long as we're around, we're going to be continuing to insert ourselves in those conversations, even if we're not invited.
Yes, I mean, when I think of the word criminal justice, for me personally, it goes hand in hand with systemic racism. That those two terms no longer, they've always, I guess, been connected. My unique perspective on that comes from just having gone through what I've been through. I'm understanding that. So one of the things that gives us a purpose and trying to make sense of what happened, for me anyways, is realizing that this happens to others and that together we can do something to change it. When I started realizing that this happens to others, I started realizing that outside of the way that I look, that this has been happening to the Black community for decades, for generations. And nothing has changed for them. And so when it comes to criminal justice reform, I don't even know if it can be reformed, because I believe that the system was designed and built to do what it's doing, to oppress people, particularly Black communities and Native American communities decades ago. We're now trying to reform something that was designed to be a certain way. My feeling is that we need to move from a criminal justice system to a restorative justice system. And only then will we actually, like, if that's the reform we're looking at, then that's what we need to do. Because with restorative justice, Black communities, minority communities are going to actually have justice, a system that works for them. This one has never worked for them. White people, and I hate to say this, have just become a casualty of the system that was designed to oppress minority communities. As long as we have the human fallibility piece, as long as we have, this fear that's put out into the public about us versus them, criminals and the public, this is all going. Washington Innocence Project will never go away. None of the innocence organizations will ever go away, because there's always going to be a need to fight that, the human fallibility piece. But before we can even get to that, we have got to go from criminal justice to restorative justice, just to give back to the Black communities and the minority communities what they've never had in our justice system.
I think the role that the role the Washington Innocence Project and other Innocence Project play is pivotal as far as bringing about criminal justice reform or restoration. And ultimately, it starts with, what we're doing now is talking to the people and trying to bring more awareness to the people about what's actually going on within the system. And most of them need to be, they all need to be aware that it starts with them, because when we're talking about reform or restoration, that happens at the legislative branch. They're the ones who crafting these policies, these laws. And I'm talking about locally within your own state. I was in Nevada and kept running up against situations where they were passing laws through the legislation that were going strictly against federal precedent, only to have to make it all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and be overturned. But wait a minute, why isn't the state of Nevada's court system in line with the framers, the constitutional framers, as they're written to begin with? Why? Because the Nevada legislator crafted these policies that allowed a certain latitude in which they took full advantage of. And as a result, people like myself, my sister, get caught up in the system for a number of years, having to having to have people like yourself, Laura, people like yourself, Valentina, Kaylin, Eliza, to advocate for us. And while all of you are doing a stellar job in doing so, ultimately, the problem with the local legislators is not being addressed, and that has to be addressed by the people. They have to hold the legislators accountable for not putting certain frameworks in place, or making sure that the framework that's in place works properly, and they're not doing so.
And I mean, obviously, when you look at my brother and I, we look different. Our skin color is different. And in that, with that being said, it puts me in a unique perspective, or position, I should say, to lend a voice to the Black community, because I'm now living what they have had to live for generations. And so what I want to say when I'm saying that is that, you know, all of you who want to donate and support this cause, it's wonderful, it's great. But we need to understand that this is no longer just that community. They are disproportionately, absolutely affected.
Right.
But I hope that when you see me, you see your daughter, your mother, your sister, because I think if more people can understand that this can affect all of us, then that will initiate the change in the legislation that he's talking about, and the Washington Innocence Project having the policy fight within the legislature that they do. When the people start speaking up enough and enough that this is happening to us, all of us as a community, then that's when change is going to finally happen.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that this is, if any of you could see the back of our t-shirts that we're all wearing, you would see that it says the truth matters. And I think that everything that Heidi and Haim are saying right now is so, it's so important to draw back to that concept that what we're talking about is real justice. That's what we're trying to achieve. That's what our system says that it achieves, is true justice. But is it? You know, so much of the fight that we have to do just to get an innocent person back into court is these procedural barriers that are put into place because our system doesn't anticipate its own mistakes. So like, no, if that appeal was final, that means that person was guilty. No, it means that procedurally they're not allowed to go forward anymore. But that doesn't mean that we've gotten to the truth. That doesn't mean that an original victim in a crime has actually achieved any level of justice because there's someone sitting in prison. And in fact, there's been a net increase in harm, a tremendous one, if you have an innocent person sitting in prison. And so a huge amount of the policy work that we do is about having these conversations. And I cannot thank Haim and Heidi enough for their perspective on this, because they are the ones in the best position to actually speak to this as it's actually happening on the ground. And the truth is, we have to change the whole conversation about how the criminal justice system, or how the criminal legal system, is described and talked about. Do we reform the system as it is? Well, maybe, or maybe we can't. But the bottom line is, we can't keep thinking of it as an us versus them kind of mentality, both with prosecutors and defense. And then, you know, who owns the victims in this case and who's going to use their narrative? How about we talk about who is actually harmed when we get it wrong in the system? There's already a harm if there's been a crime. If there's not been a crime and then there's a conviction, you've created victims in that situation and added to a tragedy. And so we really seem to have, at least historically, the conversation around the criminal legal system has treated it as if there's this finite amount of empathy in the world. That if you give empathy to the person who was wrongly convicted in this case, if you give any attention at all to the possibility that we made a mistake, then somehow that's discrediting or debasing the pain of the original victims. And that is categorically false. There's no reason for us to be looking at the system that way, because as long as we do, we're missing an enormous part of the truth. And as long as that's happening, we don't have justice, not for anyone in the system. And so this is, I think, a huge obligation that we have in the perspective that we all have, both as clients and as people who see these cases all the time, every day in every jurisdiction, that we really have to be responsible for helping to change that conversation. And it has to come down to a process like Heidi's talking about, that she's been so incredibly active and involved in in terms of working on restorative justice when it comes to the system. Otherwise, our system is just saying a lot and not doing a whole bunch. So
I'd like to, sorry, I completely wanted to talk about that restorative justice for a minute and what you were saying about acknowledging the original crime survivors and that it is not a competition and that we need to have empathy all around. Another organization that I serve on the advisory board for, Healing Justice, and I encourage everyone to look it up at healingjustice.org, was founded specifically because of what Laura is saying. The criminal justice system as is kind of has created all of this harm, and in the wake left even the crime survivors with nothing. And the founder, Jennifer Thompson of Healing Justice, who was a rape survivor, she realized that using restorative justice circles and bringing everyone that has been harmed by a wrongful conviction, so exonerees, freed clients, the original crime survivors, as well as family members on both sides. So far, we have the most holistic healing in that setting together, doing it together by those that were harmed by this criminal justice system and the wrongful conviction. And so, and this has occurred within the Innocence Project's network and in the organization. These crime survivors had to turn to Washington Innocence Project and the networks to basically get the support that they weren't getting from the criminal justice system.
I think we have one more question.
Yes, we do. And I just want to start by saying thank you to Haim and Heidi for sharing all that you have and for being so vulnerable and giving us an opportunity to hear your perspective. I feel very honored to be here and to hear from you all. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you. But the final question is Washington Innocence Project a branch of the Innocence Project in New York? So I know many of you, might have heard about the Innocence Project in various forms of media, the Serial podcast and things on Netflix. It's a very hot topic right now. And especially with what's happening in the world, people are looking for ways to contribute. And you might often see the Innocence Project on Instagram or Facebook or social media. However, when you're donating there, that money is going to the Innocence Project in New York. And we are not affiliated with them in terms of, we're not a franchise, but we are all part of the Innocence Network, which is a network of 68, I believe, innocence organizations worldwide, with the majority of them being here located in the United States. And we all kind of, have this common goal to address innocence in our criminal justice system and just be a part of the reform of this, very complex and broken system. So like I said, we don't actually, get any resources, like monetary resources, from being a part of the network or being, in partnership with Innocence Project of New York. We fundraise independently on our own. And we, we need your support. It's our, Washington State has its own unique barriers, and we're the ones working on the cases, working on the policy to reform and overcome the barriers for people who are incarcerated here in Washington State. And so to just talk a little bit also about the network, and what it does offer for us, and in terms of an opportunity to get together yearly at the Innocence Network conference that often happens in the spring, and that was unfortunately canceled this year due to COVID. It's really an opportunity for us to come together and share our experiences and share strategies. That's how Kelly and Jackie figured out how to better support Heidi. And it's an opportunity for exonerees to get together, and I'll let you all talk a little bit about that. but also our executive director, Laura, and our board member, David Owens, serve on the executive board of the Innocence Network. And they serve and set the ethical guidelines for innocence projects that are part of the network. And yeah, but I will pass it on to Heidi and Haim.
Yeah, and I just want to say to everyone out there listening that if it's important to you that you're supporting organizations in your state, in Washington State, just please do the research when you see anything that says Innocence Project or an innocent organization, to make sure it's the one that's going to where you want it to, just like with any charity. And I think we all are aware of that. As far as the innocent, and again, those resources are what enabled like Jackie to even assist with Haim's case in Arizona. So, and then going into the network, it is this network, right? It's all of these organizations that are trying to support their state and their area in the best way, but they also have to come together and share that information. And that's what the network, specifically the network conference, does. For exonerees, it gives us an opportunity to get together with all of us. I had no idea I had a community until I went to my first conference in San Antonio, Texas. And I was it's where I found Healing Justice and Jennifer Thompson, and found a path for my own healing on how to move forward. Being in a room with other exonerees, with other freed members of the innocence community, it gives us a space that we don't have anywhere else, not even with our families, not with our attorneys. Trusted, loved people that we have around us, it's still not the same as sitting in a room with just us and share. And this includes crime survivors, the harm, those harmed by the wrongful conviction. And sitting together takes us, for me anyway, it takes things off my shoulders that I normally can't leave setting behind me. It gives me a moment to breathe in ways that I don't even realize that I need. And so that's what the Innocence Conference, and again, there's sessions and ways for us to get educated and learn just to get involved. The Innocence Network has grown so much. There's so many exonerees and freed clients involved now, from each individual organization, including Washington Innocence Project. I happen to be speaking on several panels for the network in the next couple days. And we've created a diversity, equity, and inclusion council. And this is, again, made up of the network, including exonerees and freed members. And so there's just, it's this really great growing movement. And you want to add anything?
I mean, I love the form that the Innocent Network in itself provides for not only the various innocence projects to come together to get the opportunity to not only network with each other, but to educate those of us freed and exonerees, those who were wrongfully convicted, about how the system actually works, and also allows for, like Heidi was saying, for us to connect with other exonerees and be in an environment where you're comfortable. One of the things that stands out in my mind is, and I think it was actually the first benefit dinner I've gone to, and the Innocence Band.
Oh, the Exoneree Band.
The Exoneree Band. That was in Seattle. That was the first time.
And that was weeks after you got out.
Yeah. October 2nd. And Antoine said, literally, I understand. You don't have to say nothing. And that was the first time, especially being newly released, that I felt like somebody understands. and to be in a room where you have a lot of individuals who understand your experience, can give you not only support but some advice as to what you're going to have to navigate yourself through. I mean, that to me was extremely beneficial. But at the same time, I want to focus more on the individual Innocence Project of Washington's, the Washington Innocence Project, and why I feel it's essential that those who are watching this support the Washington Innocence Project, because as we were both talking about, whether it's reform or restorative justice, again, it comes back to the people, and it comes back to the people supporting Washington's Innocence Project. For Laura to be able to go to the legislators and advocate and have those laws changed that I spoke about earlier, she needs support. The Washington Innocence Project needs support. And the only way that happens is by people like yourself who are watching, get behind the Washington Innocence Project in itself, and others throughout the country, but more specifically, Laura, her team, and so on and so forth, to ensure we have people in the legislature who are advocating for us, and in the court systems who are advocating for us. So,
yeah, and your support, it absolutely is helping the clients that Washington Innocence Project still has inside, or yet to even have, but it's still helping us as well.
Yeah.
Those of us that are free clients that may still have to continue our fight, as well as the trauma and the impact that our families and we have had, the resources that Washington Innocence Project gets from their, the donations and the funds that are raised helps us get the resources and the support that we need to recover from this.
correct.
Thank you so much to everyone, and Heidi in particular. Every time I hear you both talk, and it's been years now, and I moved every single time, and I'm so grateful that you took the time not just to be here with us today, but also to make those incredible videos that are on our website now. If anyone wants to see a little bit more about their individual stories, please go there and look. And we hope that you will enjoy the feature main event film that we have put together for you. I'm so excited to share that with everyone, and so grateful for all of our freed and exonerated clients and our staff and our board for participating in that. It was quite an opportunity, and kind of a great one, to connect with everyone during COVID. So we were very socially distanced and protected, but still, as we were doing all that filming, and our incredible filmmaker Ethan Steinman with Daltonic Films, he was fantastic. So we're so excited for that. In closing, I would just like to remind you, this is our fundraising event. This is the one big fundraising event that we have every year. If you would have joined us this year at Stand for Innocence, you would have paid $150 or $200 for a ticket, and you would have gotten dinner with that. That's true. And we couldn't do dinner for you this time. Hopefully you're eating your dinner or having a drink or something while you're watching this. But we weren't able to do that dinner, but we still have the same need, even though we're not able to walk in the room. And in fact, the pandemic has really changed our work in so many ways, so that we really had to shift our focus to a lot of our incarcerated clients to try to work to just protect their physical health right now while they're in prison, so that they can survive long enough to pursue their innocence claim. This is a truly terrifying time to be in prison, and we feel that pressure, and we're doing everything we can, but we cannot do it without your support. So if you would have come to the dinner, please make a donation in the amount of that ticket. If you would have participated in Raise the Paddle, which is where the vast majority of our funds come from during this dinner, we're not able to do that this year. Please consider making that donation. If your company matches, please round up your coworkers and your employees, and make sure that the company that you work for is doing that match, so that we can really maximize our impact this year. And we hope more than anything that we're able to celebrate with you in person next year, which will also be October 1st, 2021. It's currently scheduled to be at Urban Feast in South Seattle, and we really hope to see you all then. We will be nimble and we'll adapt if we have to do something else, but we thank you so much for joining us and being here, and please support our work. Go to our website, and we hope you enjoy the film. Thank you.